Thanks. It's a great pleasure to kick things off today, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share with you really just a personal story of coming home for Highway and returning to China now for these past 7 years. And I'm going to do that by talking to you first really about this idea of 10,000 hours, which many of you maybe have heard of. It was featured in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. And the concept is really simple. Actually, through a lot of research, psychologists and other research around the world, they found that it generally takes about 10,000 hours of practice to get really good at something. So if it's playing the violin, or playing the guitar, or computer programming, whatever it is, maybe public speaking too, if you do about 10,000 hours of practice, then you become actually world class. And so I wanted to talk to you today about this idea of 10,000 hours and how each of us could achieve mastery in something, the things that we care about, by sharing with you 3 immigrant stories. So 3 basic stories that have a personal connection to me and to each other, and then come back to this idea of passion, commitment, and world-class expertise. So the first story I want to share with you is a story of Han Da-Kang, who was born in 1890 in Hongmenlo, which is actually, for those of you who aren't familiar with this little village, and in 1890 it was quite a small village, it's actually outside of Huiping, or Kaiping, as it's known in Mandarin, which is a suburb of Guangzhou in Guangdong province. But this particular city, this particular village, was quite famous, especially in the 19th century and the early 20th century. It was known as the home of the overseas Chinese. So from the 4 counties, Tuishan most famously, but in the surrounding areas, nearly 75 or 80% of the overseas Chinese can trace their roots. Even as recently as 1988, nearly 77% of overseas Chinese, especially in North America, could trace their roots to these small villages where there was a lot of poverty in the 19th century, and where a lot of people strove and reached out around the world. Da-Kang did the same. When he was about 20 years old, he, like in this drawing, got himself prepared, booked passage, and sailed for a month to get to the United States, or get to North America. He actually ended up in Canada, ended up in Montreal after that long voyage. And in Montreal, without speaking the language, he joined the workforce in his local community, and like many people, doing hard labor in a service industry, in his case, hand laundry. This, of course, was before the kind of technology revolution that would make this kind of labor much less meaningful. But his workday and his life was actually spent focusing on this hard labor and how he might make money and save and provide for his family. At age 20, he already, back in China, had a wife and a child waiting for him. And so he spent nearly 20 hours a day working for that family, saving up pennies at a time, barely resting, but also barely having a chance to spend his money, and dreaming of a chance to build his own business. In fact, even with the pennies that he did have, he would stretch his expenses as far as possible. For instance, he would buy a can of beans, and instead of having those for one meal, he would stretch it out with some plain white rice over 2 or 3 days. So this is the kind of savings that he would do. And eventually, after many years, he opened his own laundry and started his own business. And with the savings in that business, he would go back to China, like many immigrants, every year or every couple of years, and see his wife, see his family, and then have a new child. But of course, that time, the beginning of the 20th century, was a very difficult time for Chinese, actually a very difficult time for all ethnic minorities in the United States and in North America. In fact, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 19th century, and then moving on towards immigration reform in 1920, immigration to the U.S. was very difficult for all ethnic minorities, and especially for the Chinese. So family reunification, which we might take for granted these days, was impossible. And hostility and the violence that we see in this picture was all too common. In fact, so much so that Da-Kang in 1930 decided to move back to Kaiping. And in this picture, despite the conflicts that would come to China, and already the conflicts happening in China, he would settle back into the village and build one of these structures that you can see in the background with his family. These diaolo, which are one of the centerpieces of Kaiping architecture now. In fact, it's a World Heritage Site. in China, one of the 40 or so in China. But it's indicative of this diaspora, and this leaving China, going to the West, those Western influences, and you can see it in the architecture, and coming back. But the Dialo are also amazingly beautiful as a representation of community. So these structures in the jungle or in the fields would emerge 5 stories high, made of concrete, and they were there for communal defense from bandits or from warlords and other hostile influences. But in 1968, Dapong, after having returned back, did pass away. And that's where his story ends. But really it doesn't quite end, because he, of course, left a family, a rich family of many descendants who had different kinds of opportunities than he could have had because of those struggles that he put in. And so with that, he left that family of many people who would aspire and then go on to college, become professional doctors, engineers, and build a very different life than he could have ever imagined. Later in Hong Kong and then in the United States. So that's the first story. The second story is a gentleman named Joseph Chin, or Hak Zhen. He was born in Baoyuanfang, which is also in Kaiping, not far, in 1889. And he, like Dapong, was an immigrant too. Around that same age, he was married and had a child, and he also booked passage, but then he ended up first in Ohio and then later on in Michigan, where he was also working in this pursuit of a dream of Gold Mountain, as it was called then. But of course, this Gold Mountain dream wasn't the typical Gold Mountain dream where we saw so many ethnic Chinese move to California, but later also just be known as Jiujinshan, or the old Gold Mountain. But he instead ended up in Michigan working first in delivery, wholesale supply to the local community, laundry supply, or foodstuff supply, and later building his own business, doing the same, delivering to the community, working 20+ hours a day, and trying to provide for his family, which he would, again, also go back to China to start building, but later eventually unify. And as tastes changed in the local community in Michigan, he was able then, as the culinary tastes changed, build a family restaurant, opened in 1940 in Detroit, and opened for 64 years. This restaurant served millions of people in the Detroit area. And of course, more than that, he also, though he passed in 1972, also had a legacy that lived on. Over 130 descendants, an extended family of many children and many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who again also had different experiences and different expectations for life because of the struggles that he put through. And so, with that, now the third story, Chen Guoqian, who, those of you who can read Chinese, you might recognize as me. So I'm the great-grandson of these two stories, and a product of these struggles myself. I was born in 1973 in a place called Southfield, Michigan, where I ended up because of their struggles. And I was fortunate enough to grow up in that family business, here with my younger brother and younger sister, and having the advantages of those opportunities of the family business and the struggles that they've gone through. So that I would go on to a great university, ended up working in New York, where I learned how to work for others and accrue my own experiences and my own savings. Met my lovely wife, Angela, and then would have my own Gold Mountain dream, ending up first in San Francisco, joining a tech startup, moved me from New York to Silicon Valley, and then later, in 2004, joining a technology company based in Shanghai, building semiconductor wafers in this lovely city, in this lovely shop, Shanghai. Eventually, though, much like the stories of my great-grandfathers, I would go on to start my own business. In 2007, based on all the things that I've learned and experienced in my life, and reflecting upon the journey that I had, the opportunities I had, I actually started Qifang. And for those of you who don't know, Qifang is a web service, an online service for helping students in China find the funds and support they need to continue their education. So it's really in part a sense of responsibility, not only to myself and the history of my great-grandparents, but to this little guy, my son Spencer Bowen, who was then born in 2006, and my daughter Yixin Sloan, born in 2008, and realizing that there was so much that I could do, and therefore so much that I should do. And so with that, just those 3 stories of these immigrants, 2 leaving China and going to the US or going to North America, 1 leaving North America and coming to China, I'd just like to leave you with a few key things that I reflect upon as I think about these stories. First, the world has changed, of course. For someone born in China in the 19th century, to ever imagine leaving North America, leaving the United States, to come to China would have been unfathomable. Of course, later we'll see a Hans Rosling talk, but some data from Gapminder is fantastic service, a great way to understand the data out there talking about our world. You can see how much China and the United States, vis-a-vis each other, in about the 100 years since my great-grandfather was born, have changed on the basis of income per capita, but also life expectancy, the shorthand for the quality of life. And so Detroit, this beautiful city where I grew up with my family, now actually we can think of in context with Shanghai. And I did a recent search just last week looking at real estate prices. And in Shanghai, you can see the average price for a square meter of property is about 21,000 RMB, about more than 2,000 euros, right? In Detroit today, it's about 490 RMB per square meter. So actually, it's only about 2.5% the price of what real estate in Shanghai is. In other words, if you were to spend the same amount of money, you might end up with, say, just the bathroom instead of the 3-bedroom apartment. You would need to spend 44 times that in order to get a home. And upon further reflection, also looking at those cities as they are now, Detroit, of course, has a long history, but also has buildings that feel like those echoes of Diallo, the legacy of communal structures like the old hotels that were built in the 1920s in Detroit, similar times as the Diallo, but are now vacant buildings and just reminders of the past. And so the first thought for me is about thinking about where is home? Where do I belong? Where are the dreams that I'm chasing, that I believe in, and where do they lead me? To that, I add lesson 2, thinking about not just the stories of my 2 great-grandfathers, but thinking about the many, many people who were around them. Of course, my great-grandmothers, but all of the family around them that gave me the possibility to fulfill the dreams that I've been able to pursue. And I think back to that idea of 10,000 hours, and quite simply, if I only thought of my great-grandparents, great-grandfathers working 20 hours a day for a very cushy 300 days of the year, for those 20 years that they spent as immigrants building up their businesses, well, that's 12 times the 10,000 hours that Malcolm Gladwell talks about. So I think of that now, all of that time spent, and all that energy and passion, devotion to their families, as really for me, this kind of shortcut. This shortcut for me to get the 10,000 hours that I need to get ahead and to pursue my dreams and become, world-class at something. So the time they spent saving and then building out their businesses gave me the leverage to pursue an education, and as it's famously said, stand on the shoulders of giants and get further along to my pursuits. So the question from lesson 2 for me, the kind of key second point for me is about the 10,000 hours of somebody else, those 120,000 or more hours that somebody else has given to me, without me ever having had the chance to meet them. And then now just the final thought. There are many labels for all of us, and these are just some of the labels that I know for myself, and that sometimes were burdens for me. Whether it's Haigui or sea turtle returnee, or Juxing, this idea of a hollow bamboo that doesn't hold any water, or of course banana, which is white on the inside and yellow on the outside. But I never really got truly comfortable with who I am until I actually came across 2 really simple images, and then now in this pursuit of Qifang. The first one is, as I mentioned, this idea of responsibility. Being able to marry this idea of social change and profitability. Doing good for yourself while you're doing good for the rest of the world. Right? This simple idea is really powerful. And what's more, I realized that in the end, while we might think about, what are the resources that somebody has given to me? What are the things that are possible for me? How much money do I have? How many friends do I have? How much connections do I have? And I might think about the opportunities, certainly coming to Shanghai, coming to China, and realizing there are so many opportunities for us. But in the end, the truth is, what was really powerful for me is understanding that in the end, it was really just about the individual, right? In the end, we're not defined by our resources, we're defined by how resourceful we are. And in the end, wherever we look, there are always opportunities for us to pursue. And so that individual responsibility, maximizing impact, comes back. And so I've been blessed and very fortunate to work with a lot of great people. There are many more images, many more logos than I can put up here. Learn from them, collaborate, and drive impact. Think not just about resources, but resourcefulness together. And so the last question from point 3 then is thinking about who my 10,000 hours serves, and hopefully a question to you, who do your 10,000 hours serve? What pursuits, what are the things you're becoming world-class at, and who benefits from that? And so just my final point, and I know I'm almost out of time, is just to come back to this idea of 10,000 hours, and how important this idea of these virtual 10,000 hours that somebody else may bequeath to you, having met them or not. You know, in Chinese, in the Tao, we have this idea of the 10,000 things, right? The 10,000 things are the tangible world, things that actually don't mean anything, that are actually only easy to see and touch, but don't have true meaning. The Tao, the thing that is unnameable, that is unknowable, is actually the thing that has the true value in life. And in that same way, I invite you to think about whether the 10,000 hours that you spend on the things that you care about today, improving yourself, whether those are also maybe the easy things to see and touch. But what might really have value are those things that we can't name, that you can't name, that are hard to touch and feel. Thanks.